Today we're going to be talking about the Class 2 amalgam preparation and restoration. This is going to have a lot of the same principles that the Class 1 amalgam and preparation and restoration has, as well as everything we went over in the introduction to the operative dentistry lecture. So I'm going to try and not repeat any of this stuff and just focus on what's specific to Class 2s. So Class 2 lesions are typically detected radiographically, and that's because these are on mesial or distal surfaces, which is why they're called interproximal. But it's between two teeth. And if you want to detect something in between two teeth, the only way you have access to it really is either through the buccal and the lingual. And these lesions you happen right around the contact area or just gingival to the contact area, as you can kind of see right over here. The contact is right over here, and that's kind of where it starts. So to be able to get an explorer through the buccal or lingual just to where the contact area is and detect the lesion, it's not very accurate to do so. So these lesions typically form because people don't floss, or they're not flossing enough. So what happens is as you eat, food kind of gets trapped kind of right below the contact area, and if you don't floss, you can't get it out, and that's kind of where the lesion starts forming. So we detect them with bite wing radiographs, and the reason for it is because it's very parallel to the tooth. That way it's not distorted from different angles as you can get with the PA. But something to keep in mind is we're taking a 3D object that your tooth is and turning it into a 2D image. So with a bite wing radiograph, if it's parallel, we can see the extent mesiodistally, but not buccolingually. I mean, if you kind of look at it this way, you can see how close it is to the pulp mesiodistally, but we don't know how far it extends buccolingually, so you have to look at that either clinically or sometimes you don't really know until once you open up the lesion. So after we diagnose these lesions radiographically, we have to figure out when do we want to treat them. So of course, every clinician is going to have their own clinical judgment. The way we teach it here is whether or not it reaches the DEJ. And the reason for that is because if it has not reached the DEJ yet, for example, these two lesions right here, we can see that this lesion is kind of like that, and the DEJ comes right around here. It's still fully within the enamel, and when it's in the enamel, the literature pretty much shows that with good oral hygiene instructions and a lot of fluoride, you can remineralize these lesions and either make them better or keep them from progressing into the dentin. And that's because the enamel has like 99 or whatever percent mineralization. So fluoride is capable of remineralizing these lesions. When you have a lesion, something like this, that's bigger and has already reached the DEJ, that's when we teach that you have to treat it, because once it reaches the dentin, which is much less mineralized compared to the enamel, it spreads very quickly. And the problem is, unless you're monitoring the lesion over time, you don't know how fast or slow it's going to progress. So for some people, you can watch it for 6 months, and within 6 months, thing is blown up. Other people, it takes years for it to actually get bigger. But another thing is, once it's reached the dentin, as I was saying, it is a 2D image, so it may look like it's not getting that much bigger mediodistally, but it could still be expanding buccolingually. So once it kind of reaches the DEJ, that's kind of when you say, okay, we have to treat this lesion. Another thing is that radiographs do not show 100% of the caries. It only shows approximately 70%. It's based on how much the tooth has demineralized from the decay. So you can expect whatever you see on the radiograph to be much bigger clinically once you open it up. So that's another thing, is you can't be too conservative with these diagnosing with the radiographs, because the radiograph doesn't show everything. It's not perfect. So same thing, we're going to go through the same flow. You have the outline form, resistance form, retention, convenience, caries removal, and finish to margin. Same as Class 1 amalgam. So in order to access the lesions in a proximal, the way we're typically going to go is through the occlusal. And that's just because it's not very practical to go through like buccal or lingually, because A, you have stuff like the lips and stuff in the way that makes it difficult to drill. Also because if you just chunk out a bunch of stuff, a tooth structure that's gingival to the contact area, everything occlusal to that could be considered unsupported enamel if you're restoring with amalgam. So we're gonna, have our class 1 prep normally, but then you're gonna drop a box in the proximal box, what it's called. And you should break buccal, lingual, and gingival contact. And we'll see what that means in the next slide. We can see here it's a prepped tooth. And if we compare this with the other tooth, even though this is a premolar, the other one's a molar, not the same tooth, but we can see here that this tooth is no longer in contact with the tooth adjacent to it. And it's not in contact in 3 dimensions. One, we have the buccal contact. If we go through buccally, there's nothing stopping the tooth, your instrument. If we take an Explorer, we stick it through from the buccal, there's nothing stopping it in between the 2 teeth because you've broken buccal contact. Same thing lingually. The lingual side of the tooth is no longer contacting the adjacent tooth, so we have broken lingual contact. It's similar if you go through down to the gingival, we are no longer contacting the tooth occlusal apically. So this is what it means to break contact. You can see in another angle here, right over here is a gingival contact that has been broken. This is the buccal contact that has been broken, and this here is the lingual contact that has been broken. So just different angles of what the proximal box should look like. You can see we have a normal class 1 prep, and then we drop in this box in the proximal. And by doing so, we've made ourselves an axial wall and also a gingival floor. We talked about during the introduction to operative lecture. We can also see that here, axial wall, gingival floor. And we have our pulpal floor, which is up here. Pulpal floor over here. So, just some review. So resistance form. So same thing on our class 1 part, we want to have our minimum bulk of amalgam. So the occlusal part is going to be the same as a class 1. We're going to go 0.5 millimeters into dentin. So you're going to have approximately 1.5 to 2 millimeters of bulk in amalgam. So that's like your minimum. We don't want it to break. And similarly, you want to round the internal line angles. As you can see here, their line angles are round. The difference here is we have additional line angles because instead of just having a prep that looks like this, our prep now looks kind of like this. We have our pulpal floor and we have a gingival floor, so we want to make sure we round the line angles over here and over here. So retention form is going to be pretty much the same as your class 1. You're going to have your dovetails, you're going to have your convergent walls to mechanically retain the amalgam. And you can have retention grooves if you need additional retention. That'd be especially important is if you didn't have your typical, if you didn't do extension for prevention and you only had a box, which is what we call a slot prep. This will talk about more with composites, but it's doable with an amalgam too. But if you were to do that, in order to get good retention, you would have to have retention grooves right around your axial buccal and lingual line angles, or maybe an axial pulpal that's necessary clinically. But don't really want to confuse you. Don't worry about the slot prep. We'll talk about that with composites in the future. But pretty much your retention form is going to be the same as your class 1, dovetails, convergent buccal lingual walls. And you can see this at another angle. You have your convergent buccal lingual walls. You have a little dovetail going right over here. And then if you needed to, you could always put retention grooves as necessary. So finish margins, you want to remove unsupported enamel. And this is especially important for amalgam, again, because it's not bonded to the tooth structure like composite would. But what's common is you have a lip in the proximal box. So pretty much what it looks like is you drop your box, and let's say this is your gingival floor and this is your axial wall. But a lot of times is because your burr is like a pear-shaped burr, like a 330 or something. What usually ends up happening is if you don't go all the way to the edge, the natural curvature of the burr is going to keep a little what I like to call a lip that kind of forms. And part of it is because you have a tooth right next to it, and you don't want to hit this adjacent tooth, so you kind of keep your burr away from this tooth. So your burr ends up just making that lip. So that's something we don't want in our prep. So when we finish the margins, what's very helpful is if you're scared about damaging the adjacent tooth, you can use hand instruments like a hatchet or like a gingival margin trimmer, or just like any sharp instrument, and kind of just scrape away, at this area. So you go from like a lip to no lip. And again, we have a nice little rounded line angles, but you want to go from this lip into lipless. So how to restore it? It's pretty much the same as a class 1. Again, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to condense it. You're going to burnish and stutter. But the only difference is because we have this proximal box that's now no longer has a it's no longer enclosed 360 around. We have an open either mesial or distal wall. We're going to need to put something in order to make sure that we pack the amalgam without it just leaking out of the open contacts that we have. So in order to do so, we're going to use what's called a Toffel-Meyer matrix band and a wedge. And you'll see in the next slide what we mean. So pretty much what we're going to do is we're going to take a matrix band, and the way it's placed is your matrix band will either look like a upside down V or a regular V. And the way it works is once you curved it, you want the pointy, part of the V to be facing occlusally, and you want the open part of the V gingivally. And once you curl it up, it's going to look like this. So this is the pointy part, and this is the undersurface. So occlusal, gingival. And you're going to stick that into a matrix band. And a matrix band will either look like an N shape or a U shape. So you want the open side to be facing gingivally. So this is the open side, it's going to be gingival, and we want the pointed part to be occlusal. So it's the same thing as the matrix band. We want the open side to be gingival, and we want the pointed side to be occlusal. You can see that here. The pointed part is occlusal and the open part is gingival. So we're going to slide our matrix band into the Toffel-Meyer. Again, we have our pointed side occlusally and our open side gingival, occlusal. Same thing, we see the pointed part here occlusal, and the open part is going to be gingival. We see this open part here is going to be gingival, and we see the pointy part is going to be occlusal. So when we put that around the tooth, same thing. It's going to be an N-shaped with the open side towards the gingiva and a pointy side towards the occlusal. And the reason for this is because that's just the way the contour of the tooth is going to follow because of the higher contours and the way that it kind of flares upwards. Then you have your cusps and your marginal ridges. You want that to be higher, which is why you have the pointed side pointing up. So once you've placed your matrix band and you've tightened it, so you can see the video, you pretty much just have 2 screws. One screw will tighten the matrix band onto the Toffel-Meyer, and then you have another screw that kind of just pulls away to tighten the matrix band. And it's much easier if you watch the video how to do it, or if you just play with it in the lab, you'll kind of figure out how the 2 screws work. But essentially you just want to, as you turn clockwise, you're going to tighten both the screw to make sure that the matrix band is tightly in the Toffenmeyer, and as you do so, twisting it clockwise will also tighten your matrix band around the tooth. And after that, you're going to take this wooden wedge, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It is literally a wedge of wood that is going to go inside the gingival embrasure on the lingual side. Or buckle if you can fit it, but usually you don't have room because the Toffenmeyer is in the way, so you're going to go through the lingual. And wedging is going to do two main things. One is it's going to push the matrix band here against the tooth, so you're going to have very good contours around the tooth. That way you have like a very good shape, and it's going to make sure that you close the contact areas. Otherwise, what you don't want is if you don't have the matrix, the wedge pushing against it, a lot of times you're going to have your tooth, and then you're going to have your matrix band, and you're going to have like this shell of extra amalgam because it's not, the matrix band isn't tight against the tooth. So the wedge is going to push the matrix band against the tooth. And the second thing it's going to do is a wedge is actually going to move your adjacent tooth a little away, and because you're literally physically wedging this thing, shoving it through the embrasure, and you're just going to slightly move the tooth over. And what that's going to do is when you pack the amalgam inside your box, after we remove the matrix band, the tooth will, and the wedge, the tooth is going to move back into place, and then you'll have a very nice tight contact. It's going to compensate for the thickness of the actual matrix band. If you were not to put the wedge in, what a lot of times happens is once you remove the matrix band, because the matrix band has a certain width to it, that's going to be the amount of width that your contact is now open. So by wedging the tooth and moving this tooth over, once you remove the wedge, it's going to move back into place and kind of close the contact area. Another thing you want to do to make sure you have good contacts is you're going to stick the ball burnisher, as you can see in this picture. The ball burnisher, you want to burnish the matrix band against the adjacent tooth, and that's going to contour it against the adjacent tooth, and again give you better contours of your tooth and gives you better contacts with your final restoration. So 3D view, you can see how it looks like. You have your matrix band around the tooth. You can see that it's tight right over here and right over here. There's no open contacts between the margin of the there's no open contact between the matrix band and the tooth. You have a wedge that's firmly in place, which is going to move this tooth over a bit, and it's going to push this matrix band against the tooth very well. And once you've burnished it, then you're going to have a very good contour. Once you fill it with amalgam, it's going to be the same shape as the tooth was before. So you're going to condense your amalgam as you would with a class 1, little increments. You want to use a small condenser to get it in a box and make sure you pack it down all the way really well. But the tricky part is going to be removing the matrix band initially, because you're not going to show what the timing is. Because if you do it too early, what you're going to see is your amalgam is not set. And when it's not set, you're going to watch your hard worked anatomy, especially your marginal ridge, it's just going to fall apart. And you'll literally see your marginal ridge crumble as you remove the matrix band, which you don't want to see. But if you remove it too late, it's difficult to remove because it's expanded. And another thing is you can't adjust. The good thing about amalgam is before it's fully set, you can always just use a carver and carve down the amalgam if it's a little high, and you can still carve your anatomy in, but it's going to be hard to do that with the matrix band on. So pretty much you want to take your matrix band before your amalgam is fully set, but not when it's too unset. So you'll kind of figure out the timing and the consistency of the amalgam to figure out when to remove it. But in terms of how to remove it, first you want to remove the wedge. That's going to go first. 2 is the Toffenmeyer. You can see in this picture here, the Topelmeyer is gone. Normally it should be right around here. It's gone. You're left with a matrix band. And what you want to do is pull the matrix band. Instead of going straight out occlusally, what you don't want to do, you want to go lingually. Or buccally, but lingually is usually where you have more room. And the reason is because if you pull it up occlusally, then it can easily get stuck and dislodge the amalgam. If the amalgam gets stuck onto the matrix band. But if you pull it out lingually, you're pretty much sliding it against your lingual wall, and the amalgam isn't really going to go anywhere, even if it's not, even if it's unset. As you pull it away, it's not going to just fly out and dislodge. Another thing you can do is you can put an instrument on top, like your ball burner or something, on top of your marginal ridge as you pull the matrix band out to make sure that it's not dislodging it. So once you remove the matrix band, you can see you're going to pull it out lingually, and then you can kind of clean up your interproximal area, make sure everything looks good. And in order to do that, you want to use what's called a gingival proximal carver, and that's pretty much the name kind of tells you what it does. It's going to help with the gingival part, and it's going to be proximal because it's going to go between your teeth. And a gingival proximal carver comes in two sides. So one side is going to go around the buccal side, and the other side is going to go more towards the lingual side. And you're just going to go underneath your gingival margin and just go up and down, and then you can remove any overhangs you have. So if you have something that kind of looks like this, if you didn't have your matrix band tight enough, you have an overhang. As you pull up and down, you'll kind of remove the overhang away. You'll just pretty much carve away the overhang. Another thing you can use is your explorer, and just make sure you're against normal natural tooth structure and then the amalgam, and same thing, you're going to go up and down, and that way you can have an accurate contour of the tooth but also remove any overhangs you have. And then you want to check your contact with floss. So again, this is another one of those things where if you do it too early, you'll literally watch your marginal ridge crumble, but if you do it too late, then you might not be able to get your floss through. So if your contacts are too tight, but your amalgam is not fully set, then as you put your floss down through it, you can kind of lighten the contact a little bit. Because what you want is you want to have some resistance for your floss to go through, but you don't want it to be so tight where you're going to shred the floss. Another thing is if your amalgam is not set enough and you pull your floss back up, then again you can dislodge the amalgam, which is something you got to be careful about flossing. But it's sometimes very useful to pull your floss upwards, because if it shreds on the way up but not the way down, that typically means you have some sort of overhang that's cutting it on the bottom. But if your amalgam is not set enough and you don't want to risk it, then you should just pull your floss out either lingually or buccally as to not risk dislodging your amalgam. And that's pretty much it. Once you check your contacts, you're going to check your occlusion as you would normally. You would adjust it as you would in a class 1, and you pretty much finished your class 2 restoration. So good luck with this in lab. Again, it's going to take some time to get the timing right, especially when to remove the matrix band, when and how hard you should be flossing. But after you get more experience, this will kind of be almost second nature to you. So good luck, have fun practicing in lab, and of course just make sure to ask questions if you have any. Good luck.